women expressing, having been in Bible studies for years. But until they actually got to listen to each other's stories and it became safer to engage that way, they were isolated with the same group of women for years.
Longing for it.
Longing for it, and not knowing how to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Not knowing that it is as simple as engaging, naming.
And it can be learned.
It can, and practiced.
It's not necessarily simple. Yes, and
Yeah.
practice. It's not necessary. It is simple once we learn. Kind of, yeah.
With God, there is always more. More love, more life, more freedom. Welcome to Zoweh's Exploring More with Michael Thompson. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Our Heavenly Father has provided many delightful inns for us along our journey, but He takes great care to see that we do not mistake any of them for home." Join me and the team as we explore the kingdom together, discovering the deep truths and offering encouragement for the journey. There is always more. Welcome, friends and allies, to the Exploring More podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and I have the privilege of hanging out with my bride, Robin, and our good friend, Sherry, both on the Zoweh team. So as we explore more, we're in this exploration of isolation. And one of the things that we get to do at Zoweh, and what God has given us as, I think, one of our mandates, is to end isolation. What's that look like to belong? What's that look like to be invited? And so, yeah, this is something that concerns us. And in this series of ending isolation, SJ and I got to talk last time about just what does that look like with men. And I know that there's just common ground in that as human beings, as image bearers, as ones who the enemy would rather we not be connected to God and to one another. Right. You know, if you think of the great commandment, there's intimacy, oneness, and connectedness, right? Love God, be intimately connected, be in love with God, and be in love with each other. And so,
as we love ourselves.
Yes. I'm just honored to have you guys in. Let's talk about this whole idea of isolation, what seems to be moving, and it's not new. I mean, it's just not new, but it does seem like it has had a day or a season or a few years to really ramp up. So first question would be to both of you. Yeah. What does this feel like to you in your world, in your stories?
What does isolation feel like?
Yeah. Have you experienced it at all? Is it something that you've bumped up against, or is it something that has in some way, entered into different seasons or parts of your life as women?
Well, when you had asked me about this, the first thing that came to mind is when Scott went on staff with a church. And I started doing women's ministry. So it was that both and, pastor's wife, women's ministry. And I remember a pastor who had been there for a long time. He'd been in ministry a long time. And he said, Sherry, and he said Scott too, but Sherry, keep everyone at arm's length. Keep it professional. Don't share your heart. Keep that arm's length with the women that you work with. And that was the face I was making too, was the furrowed eyebrows, like, well, this doesn't seem. So the fruit of that, or maybe it's not fruit, but what came of that was I was interfacing with hundreds of women every week. And they all knew me, and they were sharing their stories with me, but they didn't know me. I knew their stories. I was bearing their heartache and their burdens. But never once was I able to share or permitted to share anything that was beyond a curated vulnerability, part of my story,
right,
that I could share. And how isolating that was, because no one knew the day-to-day me. Nobody knew all of those women, and I didn't allow them to know me.
Yeah.
And that was isolating for both of us, because eventually There are no invitations for dinner. There are no invitations
Yeah.
to be with.
Mm.
It's all work.
It's
and
professional.
It's professional.
That's so interesting. Yeah. That
And
would,
lonely.
and yeah, that would be hard. As SJ and I talked about it last time, you can be in a church full of people, a room full of people, a bar full of people, and still be experiencing isolation and
Loneliness.
and when you're advised, right, by some senior person who's been on staff or on the team or in the office, whichever that is, to be warned like that. Hey,
That's the way you do it.
keep everybody at arm's length. I mean, you could feel that in the professional spaces for men and women, but really that's interesting for the church, and I'm not saying he's speaking officially for all.
No, but from his experience.
And yet our experience has been that's not that shocking.
Yeah.
You know, as I think back to my relationships with pastors and staff, it's got to be part of the hazard of the job, you know, that if you get connected to people and you get intimate and you get close with people in the congregation, you're going to get hurt.
Right.
I mean, he had to have been speaking from some kind of experience, right?
And not just hurt, but as a pastor's wife, if you share something, it could be used as a weapon.
Right.
At some point,
Well, that's a
against you
hazard.
or your husband.
That is definitely
so there's that protecting of
Right.
him.
And
us.
And there's a protection of, I think, to not be sucked dry. That we want to, and there's a healthy balance and there are healthy boundaries to be learned and grow in. But there is that, I know there can be a self-protection of, in caring for all these hearts and souls and people, that I need to guard my resources and not be too depleted. But there's a reciprocity too, and a mutuality too, in a knowing and being known, that if we're only in the role of taking on and hearing and holding, and that can be exhausting, it can be a lot. And what kind of relationship is it? If they're relationships of people that we're wanting to walk with and share life with, we need to be known also. So
there's the danger of, you know, taking a step of vulnerability or taking a courageous step to be known, and being hurt in that space just lends itself to isolation, or advice even to be careful, you know, with giving yourself to other people. So there is a reality to isolation. Doesn't have its place just because it has its place because people, in some cases, are trying or have tried to enter in, be known, and that's the dangerous part of intimacy and connecting. You know, if those are the things that are in some ways the relief or the wonderful benefit of connecting or taking at least that chance, then isolation is very real. And gosh, if it happens a couple times, or let's be honest, as often as it happens, being hurt, being betrayed, being missed, then you really, it's just kind of this place you fall back to.
Because it's safe. It feels safe.
It feels safe. Yeah,
feels
absolutely.
It feels protective.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Right.
Yeah, Sherry and I were talking about that earlier, where connection can be risky.
And costly.
And costly, yeah.
And so we share this I just think we share this as men and as women. But when at the risk of being categorical, right, and I think about the way women bear God's image, this just feels weightier to me for women. This feels that, you know, the relational levels in which I think women have a design that they nurture and care and pursuing, with those things in mind, and having, I think we all have that part of us that love requires connection and intimacy. And so isolation absolutely is going to be a train wreck. To one man had this comment the other day. Part of his wounding in his story was he was invisible. And so he was telling us the story that, and it gets on this autoplay. I'm talking about a man's story now, but I want to just set up you guys for some of the women's stories and how this might feel. So the message that's playing in his heart and mind, especially with his false self, is I'm invisible. It comes back to his father wounding and some things like that had happened. And yeah, even at a young age, he felt isolated. And so the agreement, the vow was, I'm invisible, so I'm always going to play it safe. I'm going to be in the shadows. So recently he was telling me that he is, learning that that's just been 30, 40 years of just wasted time and very painful. So he's starting to get kind of back in the game, let's say. So he set himself next to a couple guys he was telling the story about a couple guys who were talking, and he set himself there close by, but he so wanted them to invite him in. Mm-hmm. And when they didn't, it's like, see, we did the Beauty and the Beast thing. See, they're not, I'm invisible again. Well, come to find out, these two guys, and I was one of the two guys, these two guys thought he wanted to be by himself, that he had placed himself in a position and was looking away. He didn't come close enough to, when somebody comes and stands over you, you kind of know man, can I get in? Can I be with? Right. Can I join you?
He was not giving off that vibe.
Yeah, but that was normal to him. And so it was just a way that some of these tapes can play in this particular man's life. And I've felt that way. I felt like the young one, and these guys are more mature. I wish they'd let me come play. You think of the playground or the on the court. I wish they would invite me to come in and play. Mm-hmm. But you stand outside the fence. Mm-hmm. You just don't want to get in closer to where the rejection would be real.
Right. Or the lunch table.
Mm-hmm. All of that, And I know we're talking about elementary school, but oh my gosh, this goes right into, the world in which we find ourselves. So, women, is it different? Do you find that there's a unique space that isolation tends to work in women's lives?
Well, I wonder if some of it is around our children. That, it's that double-edged sword where we can feel like we're plugged in with other moms, but we're so busy running kids around. Mm-hmm. That are you really plugging in with the other moms, or are you just standing there with the other moms while the kids are doing what the kids do? Mm-hmm. I just hear from moms. I mean, I have one son, so I don't know that I felt the stretch of scheduling, but I hear what some of these moms are doing with their kids and all the places they are and needing to be, and between the sports and the choir and the this and the that. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine where there's time for anything but isolation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about relationally is even in how we interact with each other and how we communicate and connect and listen and really hear when we talk about being known. Mm-hmm. And knowing and being known, being seen and heard. And we've talked about how even in conversations, we can feel very alone if we are not engaged well, if our story is not engaged well. Just recently, I was sharing with you, Sherry, I shared about a death in our family. I was texting with some close friends. I shared about a death in our family and in the context of things that we were I was feeling the weightiness of around our family. So I was telling these friends, I can't get together. I have these, I'm feeling this. And how different it felt to me when one of them texted and said, praying for you. And then another said, wow, that feels weighty, because I had used the word weighty, and she said, yes, that is weighty. And then she said, and so painful for you. Mm. And I just started to cry because I felt like she saw me. She read between the lines. She really heard me. Right. And named that for me. And I felt like she joined with me in my pain. I felt like it just let me release some tears and allowed for some grief. Mm-hmm. And it makes me think, too, of when we're quick to say, I'll pray for you. That can almost, we were talking about this earlier, I can almost feel more lonely because someone can easily throw that out and not really take the time to engage me and care. And then where Sherry might say, I'm praying. And then she writes out a prayer for me that's so personal and that so speaks to what I'm going through. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I think even in our listening, we can either bring healing and life and engagement in beautiful ways, or we can contribute to the isolation. And it's not realistic to think that every single conversation we can meet them and engage perfectly, beautifully.
Right. But as we perpetuate or we participate sometimes in small groups and Bible studies, and those are great, and we're learning the Word of God and we're learning about God, and yet sometimes we share personal things, and if those personal things aren't engaged that way, and they're skimmed over, and we'll pray for you, and you don't get to the issues of the heart, you can be in that Bible study for years and never know the women you're with. Right. And or be known. That chronically. We hear that with the Zoom call that we had last week for Around the Table for the deepening community. Yes. Women expressing, having been in Bible studies for years. But until they actually got to listen to each other's stories and it became safer to engage that way, they were isolated with the same group of women for years.
Longing for it.
Longing for it. And not knowing how to do it.
Right. Yeah.
Not knowing that it is as simple as engaging, naming. Mm-hmm.
And it can be learned.
It can, and practiced.
It's not necessarily simple. Yes, and practice. It's not necessary. It is simple once we learn.
I think that's another podcast of what does that really look like? Because people think they're engaging when they say, I'll pray for you. So I think there's a lot more to, when we think of ending isolation and you say, well, one thing you can do is to listen. Mm-hmm. And then we're opening up this can of, well,
I'm a great listener.
I listen. I know how to listen. Well, by your comments and by your advice or by your tendency to want to relate and like, we lost someone last year. And all of a sudden, you're really not listening. You're not empathizing. You're not connecting.
Yes.
You're
co-opting.
Yeah, and I think that's another podcast, or maybe we just need to talk about it a little more on this podcast of, that's huge. That's the difference between contributing to isolation when somebody takes that courageous step of, this is what happened.
Yeah, being vulnerable.
Whether they're texting or on a phone call or in a circle or just with you over lunch or coffee, and they're risking being known. And let me ask this, I don't know if we can bottom line this, but what are 3 or 4 of the things that people do to add to people's isolations? I had no idea we were going to go this direction, but I really think we need to go this direction because, and then we can take a break.
It's hugely significant.
Because I know you guys have written some things in the deepening journey and tried to give women and the men on our team, some real important vantage points into leading small groups, facilitating conversations, and entering into what we call medic appointments, or just being with. So what would be a couple things? Let's play this game: 2 do's and 2 don'ts. And I know there's more, but let's get to another podcast. But I think before we take a break, this would be really good, because we don't want to contribute to people's isolation. And I think naivety and ignorance of what you guys are about to say is going to play into, taking isolation the wrong direction, and reinforcing it rather than coming to the aid, coming to help. What would you say? A couple do's and a couple don'ts.
I think for me, the do would be to be present and to name what you hear in the conversation. I know my friend Robin wants to make sure that I'm heard.
I forgot we're on video.
So I get it feels like it's
Be
tied
present.
to the do not, which is do not be afraid of saying the hard things, naming what they're already feeling. Because I think I've been afraid in the past that if I talk about how painful whatever you've just described is, I'm making it worse.
Yeah.
So do be present and name those things, and don't be afraid.
Yeah. When I hear present, I just want to add, give them your eyes, give them your face. I mean, the phones are almost one of the worst things, even preparing to meet with somebody. If you can get this thing, leave it in the car, get it out of there, be unequipped with sit on it, but to be present is to give them your eyes, to give them your shoulders to square up. It may be the fork down. I mean, there's some little things that can really matter. Like, okay, leaning in. So I just wanted you to define being present more. And then what was the don't?
Well, don't be afraid to name those things.
Okay, like what do you mean?
Because it's not going to make it worse.
I just had my brother-in-law pass away. That just happened.
Right.
And
so
it's really hard. So what do you mean by, how would that look if I was sharing with you, we're going through a really heart-aching time, and my little sister, 10 years younger, and my 2 nieces, this is a hard time, Sherry. Thanks for asking.
Michael, that's you're carrying a lot of hearts. That sounds like a lot of overwhelming pain and grief.
That's
for
good.
all the people in your world. It's not just your own heart, but you've got so many people who are looking to you. That sounds really weighty and significant.
Yeah, it is. That's good.
I'm sorry.
No, I hear you. We went from a practice round to a reality round that fast. And that's very helpful versus somebody that has passed away, or, you know exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
That's kind of in that don't space.
And so to segue, even in that scenario, in the don't space, so what not to say would be, oh my gosh, Michael, I know exactly what you're going through. I lost my brother-in-law, or I lost a family member last year, and it's so hard. What I've just done to you is I've left you. I've made it about myself, and 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, you are going to say to me, oh my gosh, Robin, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So I've left
if I have the capacity to even do that.
Right. But I've left you, and then you're having to care for me. So
we were taught
it's isolating.
We were taught to relate to people though that way. It's very interesting what you're talking about. A very different, validating way, even though somebody's in pain. Because if somebody is isolated or is experiencing pain, those go hand in hand in what is going on in their world. And so for them to kind of peek out and think, well, maybe I could share something, and then you make it about you in an attempt to relate, that is not ending isolation.
Right.
As a matter of fact, we're contributing to something that is, didn't feel good.
We want to try to rescue you from your pain. And I think that's a way to do it by relating. But
in
actually,
a bad way. You're saying that's not good.
It's not good.
And so to add insult to injury to your don't would be a comment like, well, Michael, at least you still have your sister. You still have your parents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how isolating is that? How painful is that? A double dose on top of the, I've lost someone too. I mean,
So two things I'm hearing. One is to not provide the sunny side.
Right.
And then the second one is not to provide the Me Too thing. The I get it.
Right.
But rather just be okay. Enter into more their pain rather than try to pull them from it.
Yeah. And not to minimize it.
Right. It's okay. I remembered.
Yeah.
In my trying to rescue you and thinking that's going to be helpful to you, it's actually I'm uncomfortable with your pain. So I'm trying to rescue you and I'm trying to rescue me by changing it up and making it about me, and let's move up here or over here.
That if you guys are right, and I know you are, it's actually making two people feel more isolated.
Yes.
Though they might be feeling like they're standing shoulder to shoulder. And it's very, very interesting.
And I'll tell you the proof is in the pudding. For me, when I share something vulnerable, when Sherry responds to me like she just did to you, it feels different to me. It allows me to take a deep breath, and I feel seen and known, and it truly does open a space. It brings healing because she is joining me in my hurt, in my pain, and not offering advice, not slapping a Bible verse on it. She's truly joining me which is Jesus, joining me in it.
That's why I wanted to go a little further into being seen and known, because some people can think they're doing good when they're doing harm. I wanted you to talk about that some more, because I know you, I know the journey you've been on, how we've all been talking about this. And so being seen and known doesn't mean, offering the sunny side or in some shape or form having to relate to them from your own story, or advice, but rather just validating. I can't get away from that word, how it is part of the treatment, for isolation and pain is validation. And what does that look like? To listen well and to be okay with saying little, very, very little. And what if there's even another question in there?
Yeah.
Were you close? Did you know them? How's your sister doing?
Yes.
I can think of a handful. And did you say they had children?
Yeah.
That must be hard for them. Are you going to get to see them? No, that's another part. We can't go to the funeral. Da 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 da. I mean, we went to this particular memorial and funeral. We're a part of that, but that's just very different as a opportunity to literally enter into somebody's pain that is starting to pull them like that riptide into isolation. And how many of those I think of? You only need a couple bad encounters before I don't want to share this with anybody anymore. And there is the agreement. This nobody knows, nobody sees me, nobody knows me, nobody wants to know me, nobody can.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, I think what I want to do is just tee up. We'll talk about the enemy's role in this, some of our past story and history, and how that begins to play into isolation in the lives of women when we come right back on the Exploring More podcast. We'll be right back. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Exploring More. The landing page for this podcast is zoweh.org/podcast. That's ZOWEH.org/podcast, where you can find the show notes and various platforms to which we broadcast. You can also find us and the Life of More by visiting Zoweh on YouVersion Bible app, Right Now Media, our Facebook page, and Zoweh on Instagram and Twitter. Remember, with God there is always more, and you were made for more.